The Sculptor's Funeral is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/sculpt. Over 150,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. That's audibletrial.com/sculpt. From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Hi everybody, Jason here. I really was planning on taking a break over Christmas and New Year's, but I wanted to comment a little on something concerning one of the recent episodes of The Sculptor's Funeral. And it's too long to be an addendum to another podcast, so I thought I would sneak it in this week as sort of a mini episode. So, a few weeks ago, I did a news and notes episode that covered the controversy surrounding the Elgin Marbles, the collection of British sculptures taken off the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, and then transported to the British Museum almost 200 years ago. And I talked about that and the ongoing debate as to whether or not these works should be returned to Greece. It's a fascinating topic, not least because there are very good arguments to be made on both sides of the issue. I came down on one side, and people I know and respect come down on the other side, and both sides have valid points, and we can discuss and debate until we're all blue in the face. It's the episode of The Sculptor's Funeral that has generated the most discussion on the Facebook page and elsewhere. And for me, it's gratifying to see conversation generated which shows how passionate people can be about sculpture. It makes me feel like I'm doing my job, even if I did stir the pot a little bit. But one part of the episode on the Elgin Marbles raised a few eyebrows where I did not expect them to be raised. In making a point about the Elgin Marbles' significance to the nation of Greece, I made a statement that made at least one listener question my sanity, and several others question my judgment, and several more question just what it was exactly that I was talking about. I'll play a clip so you can hear for yourself. With the exception that the works might be further damaged by moving them, I don't see a single compelling reason to keep them in Britain. I'm not saying they should go back, I'm just saying there isn't much of a case for them to stay, compared with the arguments on the other side. My own personal feeling is that the statues themselves, as ruined and fragmentary as they are, have basically, I think, little value as works of art. But they have a tremendous value as a symbol of national pride and a symbol of the birth of Western civilization. My goodness! Did you just hear what I said? My own personal feeling is that the statues themselves, as ruined and fragmentary as they are, have basically, I think, little value as works of art. Little value as works of art. Little value as works of art. What the heck was I thinking? The Elgin Marbles, the ancient works which formed English neoclassical and Victorian taste, have little value as works of art? The main attraction to the British Museum has little value as a work of art? Have I blown my credibility? Should I apologize? Should I resign in disgrace? Well, what I should do first and foremost is something that I should have done in the episode itself, and that is explain what I meant when I said little value as works of art. And in explaining what I mean, I will open up a little can of worms that doesn't get talked about all that much by us sculptors, the creators of art. And that can of worms is, does art die? Does art ever stop being art? And if it does it move directly from the realm of the art object into the realm of the mundane? Or is there an in-between state, where it's not sacred, not profane, but something in the middle? Now, before we get into all that, let me explain a particular point of view that I've developed over time. It wasn't something I read and then adopted. It just started out as an intuition, a feeling that over time and experience developed into a real conviction. And it all starts, as many things do, with Michelangelo. I arrived in Florence for the first time on the last day of July 1996, and on the first day of August, I found myself for the first time in the Piazza della Signoria, a piazza that regular listeners to the podcast will be familiar with, even if one has never been to Florence. It's the piazza, right, that is home to works by Donatello, Giambologna, Cellini, Aminati, and also Michelangelo's David, the towering triple life-size statue of the shepherd boy on the verge of manhood, The statue everyone on Earth knows, whether you have seen it in person or just have it on a t-shirt or maybe as a refrigerator magnet. Well, when I first arrived in Florence back then, I was poor, really, really poor, and I wasn't able to get into many museums at all in my first year. I think I was in Florence for 3 months before I went to my first museum, which was, of course, the Bargello, the National Sculpture Museum, but I was there in Florence to study sculpture, and I read up on everything I could about Florentine sculpture, mostly at the British Institute Library, which is an English language lending library here in Florence. And remember, this was in the very early days of the internet. There were no YouTube videos that I could watch. I mean, I didn't even have a computer, much less a smartphone. And so learning about anything took actual effort compared to now, it seems. And anyway, that's when I first delved into Michelangelo and his David, a statue I knew by heart, but knew very little about. And that's when I found out that the statue of the David was originally meant to go on top of a buttress on the Duomo, but no one could figure out how to get it up there, so instead it was placed in front of the town hall, called the Palazzo Signoria, where it was instantly recognized as a potent symbol of the Republic of Florence, as it stares directly towards Rome and the aggressive giant which resides in Rome in the form of the Holy See. I learned that the David wasn't famous for being the most beautiful statue ever made, which is a common misconception, but was famous because of its being the first colossus sculpted in a single piece of marble since antiquity, as well as the first large, ideal, freestanding marble nude since antiquity. But it was famous most of all, at least in its beginnings, for perfectly capturing the essence of Florence in the early years of the 16th century. It is zeitgeist incarnate. It may be the world's most perfect piece of public art, a sublime metaphor for a time and a place and a people, one in which the people of Florence could recognize themselves and take heart from. And that's not all I learned in my reading. I also learned that for the last several weeks of sketching, staring at, and otherwise studying the sculptures themselves in that marvelous piazza, that I had been duped. The wondrous David that had so mesmerized me on my second day in Florence was, in fact, a fake. Well, okay, not a fake, but a copy. A replacement copy. The original David had been moved indoors for protection over a century before, and a painstaking replica was carved using plaster cast which were taken directly from the original. Later, when I could afford it, I went to the Accademia Museum to see the original, and the original is stunning. The section of the museum that the David is in was built from the ground up specifically to contain the David, and there is no single statue that I can think of that is displayed more grandly. Even though its replacement outside in the piazza is very exact, the original, in its indoor home, has a splendor that the copy shows no sign of. The original is by far a more impressive sight. And yet, something about the David, the original David, made me feel a bit uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it for a while, but eventually, maybe like weeks afterwards, I realized that I preferred the copy out in the piazza to the original in its shrine. I'm sure I wouldn't have felt this way had I not learned about and grew to appreciate the significance of the work relative to its position in front of the town hall. But I strongly felt then, as I do now, that removing it from its location had the effect of destroying the function of the sculpture. As a work of public art, it ceased to function. The original David is amazing for many reasons, but it is now literally a museum piece, not a piece of functioning public art. The copy in the piazza now has that role, and as such, I enjoy it and appreciate it more. It means more to me. I experience it in a way that is richer than the way I experience the beautiful, beautiful original. But that's just me. I have always been drawn to sculpture that has a function, a need, a purpose. I've never been particularly drawn to art for art's sake, nor do I have much interest in self-expressive art. I like my art to do something, to interact with the world, to represent something and have meaning and relevance outside of itself and in the real world in which it occupies. I think one of the noblest things a sculptor can do with their talent is to create memorials. I've made several funerary monuments and even a small memorial fountain, and there's nothing more humbling than having someone seek you out, and identify with your work to the point that they want to use your work to help remember someone they've lost. My work will never be more important or relevant to the real world than it is in this context. And public art, like the David, is very similar to this. The David, in its day, reminded Florence who they were, where they have come from, and how they saw themselves in a larger context. And with the David, as with all public art, the siting, the environment, that is, the physical location of the work, is very important. The location provides context. It's part of the functioning artwork itself. Removing the David into a museum removes the context of the piece in relation to Florence. In a museum, in any museum, works of art are reduced to the self-contained accidents of the work itself. Museums are sparsely furnished and painted in neutral tones to specifically remove context from the real world that might color the judgment of the viewer of a work of art. Museums are designed to be aesthetically neutral, to avoid contamination of the artworks from foreign elements. And it's exactly the opposite of what happens when sculpture is placed in the public realm. Now, we should note that this is a problem which primarily concerns formerly public artworks. The typical canvas or panel painting are usually not meant to be seen in context with their environment. And there are exceptions, naturally. Altarpieces are a good example. But generally, paintings are aesthetically self-contained, right? I mean, that's what picture frames are for, after all, right? To more clearly define and enhance the world of the painting, setting it off as something in some way apart from our physical world. Likewise, most sculpture doesn't rely on the outside world to provide context to the piece. They're perfectly fine in a museum and benefit from the beige walls and the large empty rooms. But art meant for the public realm must be designed to compete with all the sights and noise of the real world and to seize a place in the world and enhance its immediate surroundings in a number of ways. I mean, that's why public art is generally very big, of course, right? And it's also why we put stuff up on pedestals. It's not to distance the work from the world, but to provide a megaphone, a visual megaphone, so that the work carries further. And when a public work takes its place, it becomes a part of the fabric of its surroundings, right? It interacts with it visually, and thus the public sculpture becomes fully functional. Now, the concept of function in art isn't one you hear about much. Certainly public and memorial sculpture isn't the only way sculpture can have a function. I got a degree in sacred art several years back, and one of the points driven home from the very beginning by my instructors was the essential difference between sacred art and just plain old religious art. Now, religious art is art with a religious theme, a narrative painting from the Bible, for instance. But sacred art has a purpose and a function. Sacred art is a tool used in the practice of any religious ritual, and every religion has them. So sacred art includes church buildings themselves or any sort of temple, crucifixes, altars, tabernacles, altar pieces, whether sculpted or painted, even things like incense and ritual clothing, robes and that sort of thing. They're all considered works of sacred art. They are tools of ritual. And these tools have certain forms they must take in order for them to function as required. It's a bit like public art, which is designed under a different criteria, which must take into account its environment. And like public art, sacred art ceases to function when it's removed to a museum. In the museum, both public art and sacred art devolve, right? Sacred art just becomes religious art at that point. It's no longer a tool being used. Anyway, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that museums are great for a certain type of art, and death for other types of art. Function seems to be the difference, whether it's an actual physical function like a tabernacle, or a metaphorical function, such as the symbolic presence of the spirit of a town, like what is represented in the David. And it's the same with the Elgin Marbles. When removed from the environment of the Parthenon, they ceased to retain the original function they once had. And yet the Parthenon sculptures are a special case even in light of other public art. For one thing, the Elgin Marbles are fragments of a larger work of art. And that larger work of art, of course, is the Parthenon itself, which remains in place even though it is a ruin. So there is an argument to be made. In fact, the argument has been made by no less than the British Museum director, Neil MacGregor. The argument has been made that the removal of the sculptures from the Parthenon had a transformative effect on them. And to quote the director of the British Museum, Neil MacGregor, he said, "They stopped being architectural details in the Parthenon and became sculptures in their own right." I agree with that statement to a limited extent. They certainly stopped being architectural details, but what kind of sculpture did they then become? Now that question might seem strange at first, but consider how unusual their current incarnation actually is. Not only are they in no way physically connected to the original intent of their creation, they're also fragmented ruins, right? They're missing heads and limbs, and their surfaces have been degraded by time and bad conservation. The works as we know them would be difficult for their own creators to recognize. In a sense, they are as much a found object or an accidental creation as they are the product of a sculptor. Sculptors started it, sure, but time, war, vandalism, and conservation all played a role in creating what we see today. Even in their ruined state, most people find the Elgin Marbles to be beautiful. But they are in a museum not only because we find them beautiful, they are there for their cultural significance. This cultural significance is of more value to us even than the aesthetics of the works. Right? The actual condition or form, the physical beauty itself, is actually secondary in the Elgin Marbles. Now, the charm of fragmented sculpture lies in the idea that we, the viewer, add our own imaginings of the completed work, and thus engaged, we connect more to the sculpture. And that's why we're drawn to Michelangelo's unfinished work as well. But it makes me wonder, how far can we go with this idea? Let's take the headless statue of Elysius from the Elgin Marbles for an example. Now, it's already lost a head and both hands and the legs below the knees. Well, what if we break off another piece or two? Let's say the legs up to the waist. Is it still the Elysius? What if it were in 10 pieces? Is it still art, or is it a bunch of rocks? What if the work were ground down into powder? At what point does the sculpture cease to exist? Well, if you are a conceptual artist, you would say never. It doesn't cease to exist, even in powdered form. A conceptual artist would be quite at home with displaying a bucket of crushed rock and giving it the title Elysius. The art is in the conception of the viewer. The significance and meaning with which we might imbue the statue isn't diminished, it's just its physical shape that's diminished. And we've already seen that the physical condition of the Elgin Marbles has very little to do with the value people place on them. So does that mean that treating a fragmented, displaced ruin of a statue as though it were like any other museum piece makes it a conceptual work of art rather than a figurative one? Are the Elgin Marbles figurative statuary, or are they more of a conceptual work? Well, this being a podcast for figurative sculptors, I know some people are probably balking at the idea, at the notion that the Elgin Marbles are essentially conceptual works rather than works that should be judged on their visually aesthetic qualities. I balk at that notion as well. But to approach these works like any other intact, self-contained sculpture, that really doesn't work either. Fortunately, there's a word for what the Elgin Marbles are. Technically, and in an ontological sense, they are relics. Now, we use the word relic today in a derogatory sense. We denote anything that is very old or irrelevant or decrepit as a relic. But of course, that's not the real meaning of the word. And there are different kinds of relics. But all relics share the same basic idea behind it. Relics of every stripe are cherished remnants of something whose original state no longer exists. In the Catholic Church, a relic can be the bone of a saint. Now, a bone was part of that saint, but we can't say that the bone is the saint. It is a remnant, which is venerated and cherished as it carries a good deal of significance for people of that faith. That's a religious relic, but there exist cultural relics as well. As Wikipedia defines it, a cultural relic is something that has survived the passage of time, especially an object or a custom, whose original culture has disappeared, but also an object cherished for its historical or memorial value. I think that description perfectly fits the Elgin Marbles. So are relics of art still art? Or have they become something else? Maybe art relics are still art, but art in a fundamentally different context. I think a big clue as to how we should view the Elgin Marbles is the fact that they are not in an art museum. The British Museum is the museum of human history and culture. It's not like the Met or the National Gallery or any other art museum. It is for artifacts of cultural significance. Maybe if we view the Elgin Marbles as relics of art rather than art itself, we can frame the whole debate as to where they should go in a less heated context. I find that if I think of the Elgin Marbles as relics rather than, living works, for lack of a better term, I care a whole lot less about where they are and where they should go. After all, relics rightly should be conserved in a museum, and the question of where that museum is, London or Athens, is largely a political and economic one. But do you know what I would do if I were king of the world? I would move them back to Athens, but I would reinstall them on the Parthenon, where they have always belonged, and I would let them die a noble, natural death, rather than keeping them on life support in a museum, which for public art is already a living death. But that's not going to happen. We, as a culture, will be bound and determined to keep the Elgin Marbles on life support. We feel we owe it to succeeding generations to preserve them, just as the generations before us felt. No one wants to be the generation that dropped the ball on maintaining cultural heritage. And so the time may come when one day our distant descendants will line up at the British Museum to see buckets of gravel which were once statues. So when I said, my own personal feeling is that the statues themselves, as ruined and fragmentary as they are, have basically, I think, little value. I was misleading and lazy and not explaining what I meant. I should have said, my own personal feeling is that the statues themselves, as ruined and fragmentary as they are, have little value to them as works of art, but as relics of art, they are culturally significant. But I'm glad I goofed up. Actually, it gave me a chance to talk about this in the detail I think it deserves. But again, this is based on my intuition and opinion. This is not anything anyone has to agree with. It's just my perspective. And if you have a different one, I would love to hear it. Remember, you can rant and rave about this topic and more at our Facebook page. You can comment and listen to the entire archive of the podcast for free at thesculptorsfuneral.com. You can send me a personal email message at thesculptorsfuneral@gmail.com. And thanks again for listening. I'll be back next week.